Thank you very much. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here, to be invited. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I must say that it's very difficult to speak a talk after Professor Duch. Firstly, because I was encouraged to talk about my studies, which is basically psychophysics and cognitive psychology mainly. So it will be much more detailed, I guess, but I hope you'll stay with me. And secondly, because I will not provide you any, broad plans, I will rather focus on the main question that I just want to ask here. And what I'm mainly working on is just basically the investigation of the cognitive neural mechanism of conscious awareness. And because of the time, and also because the way we work on it, I focus on this cognitive part. I will focus on it mainly because I'm experimental psychologist by training, and we are just right now developing this part of the project that is related with the neuroscience scientific measures. But I'll present you some results at the very end of the talk. So, of course, I need to start, for those of you who haven't heard nothing about consciousness studies yet, about some typical assumptions in the consciousness literature. And I just want to show you that we are trying to approach the question from slightly a different angle, I would say. And then I will just focus on the questions that we are trying to investigate. So firstly, I'll just introduce with the measure that we are using in most of our study, which is basically the subjective measure of consciousness, which sounds complicated, but it's usually a very simple question in which you ask people to rate their visibility or confidence of what they see or something like that on usually like 4-point scale. So sounds like a scale, but it's actually the judgment, basically. And then I'll just present you with a kind of set of studies in which we will try to investigate what influence this visibility judgments. And trying to show you both the mechanisms that we found on the way, and then secondly, I just want to show you some ideas that we have about the models that we can propose to understand them better. And I'll finish with a draft of something that I call the dynamic level interaction model. In Poland, when you're doing the habilitation, you need to have a model, right, which is basically your own ideas of how to approach to the field. So that's what I just proposed some time ago, and encouraged by the fact that a lot of people, especially philosophers, found that useful to some extent. I'm just trying to develop it now in our lab. So I'll just tell you a few words about it. It's very general and it's quite preliminary, but I hope you will find it interesting. And of course, as promised, some things about the neural underpinnings of what I'm talking about at the very end of the talk. So starting with the very typical assumptions, we need to start with the definition, just to let you know which group I am, in a sense, which part of the consciousness study I will cover here, is that we can understand consciousness as wakefulness, basically, and this is something that is usually investigated in the context of patient studies. You can think about the consciousness as a process of that is enabling integration. So Professor Duch mentioned stand-the-hand theory that is basically suggesting that consciousness is mainly for that. And then consciousness is something that makes the information accessible. So it's usually connected with and this way we usually connect the consciousness with attention, but not necessarily. There are other models that propose more or less the same in a slightly different way. Of course, we can understand consciousness as something that is kind of opposed to the automated processing, so something that allows you the adaptation, creativity, whatever else, is way too complex for the psychophysics. So I'll just leave it aside for now. But what we usually want to kind of keep in our data is some measure of subjective content. So in a sense, we are just trying to describe the way the system, the cognitive system works for humans. Namely, it shouldn't just reproduce what is on the input. It's supposed to transform it somehow, transform into what we actually perceive. Okay, and this is something that in theories. In the philosophical theories, is usually described as qualia, namely something that is indifferable, intrinsic, private, directly and immediately accessible information. But of course, we need to somehow, kind of measure it, and that's why we propose the subjective scales of awareness that I start with, and I'll show you in details in a second. So I'll focus on two of those features. So namely, I'll just show you about the studies about the accessibility of the information, but I'll also try to convince you that we will not measure only the accessibility, but also the subjective experience that is related to this accessibility of the information. Some typical assumption that you usually make in the consciousness study if you kind of try to sum up all the theories that are right now on a table. So firstly, if you want to investigate the consciousness scientifically, you're supposed to probably focus on one thing, because it's basically too broad. Right? So the topic is basically too broad. So that's why we usually investigate the one type of the content, and like half or even more of the theories are basically focused on perceptual awareness. Perception is well described, both biologically and cognitively, so that's a kind of the good starting point. And of course, there is a lot of theories that propose so, and also there is a lot of reason why it was indeed a good idea at the time that when consciousness study, research has been started in the early 90s. But I'll just want to try to convince you that maybe it's in time just to kind of go ahead. So just basically try to compare in between the mechanisms that are responsible for awareness of the different contents. Then what you usually hear, or what would you usually hear from the people who are working on consciousness studies, is that the consciousness is mainly about the availability. So whether something is available for you or not. And consciousness is something that make you access the information. But the idea behind is that there is an information, and then you've got the part of the system that basically represents this content. So this is still the same content, but it's basically re-represented. And of course, it could be taken directly in the way that I just described, which is hierarchical theories of consciousness. But there are many different models which propose more or less the same. So the idea behind is that you've got the one content, and then you just basically propagate it over the brain, but it's still the same content. Nothing magical is happening on the way. And this is also questionable according to the research that I just want to show you. This is, of course, related with the neurobiological mechanism that was proposed behind. So the idea is that when we focus on the perception studies, and especially in the visual awareness, the information that is perceptual is that then fed into the higher level cortical areas, namely it is represented by broad networks that are engaged attention and controlled processing. And this is also described in a very broad list of models that some of them are listed again. And finally, that is somehow connected with the question of the metacognition. Okay, so when you're just think about what does it mean you judge your visibility, for example, what does it mean you know what you're aware of, then you again just basically think that, or just describe it as a kind of the process of the accumulation of the evidence. So you're just got this perceptual thing, but this time you try to treat it as a kind of information that could be accumulated over the time, and then magic happens. You just basically describe it. It's not only the information that's in your brain, but something that you can describe later. And what I'm just trying to argue today is that maybe it's supposed to go broader, so to not focus on perception on itself, and especially do not focus on the visual perception on itself. Then I would just like to show you that there are some other information above perception that should be taken into account if you want to describe the way that we form our visibility judgments. And then, of course, it's also related with some ideas on how it may be organized on a neural level. And I'll just refer some metacognition theories that were kind of inspiration for us at the very beginning. And I think that the studies that we are making can also contribute to the metacognition literature as well. So to say this at the very beginning, let's focus on some studies. So as I said, we just you are using the kind of set of methods that are just broadly called the subjective measure of consciousness, which are like these 5, right? Namely, this is basically confidence rating, so the rating in which you judge to what extent you're confident what you're seeing, hearing, remembering, whatever else, right? Of course, it's questionable whether it's actually measuring awareness, because the confidence is kind of the construct that is not so clear, that the relation of it with awareness is not so clear. But yeah, there are multiple people who are using it in this context. Then you've got the post-decision wagering. That's basically a very similar method, but it's basically using money bets. So you're just betting a certain amount of a certain sum on your response, and this is supposed to reflect to what extent you know what you have seen, for example. Then there is also a feeling of warmth, so it's like a feeling of familiarity in a sense. And the two most often used are perceptual awareness scale, which is basically 4-point scale saying that I saw nothing, I saw a glimpse, I saw something almost clearly, and I saw it clearly. Yeah. And continuous scale, that is basically very similar, but doesn't get the intermediate points, but you can basically choose by cursor the position on the line that is in between the scale extremes. So how you can apply in the context of the study? So here we'll start with this psychophysical experiments. So in a typical experiments like that, you're using the backward masking paradigm. So you've got the picture. Let's start with something like meaningful. So that's a face, okay? And then the face is presented in a psychophysical design. Sometimes it's very short, sometimes it's much longer. There are trials at which you see them clearly, and there are the trials at which you probably do not see them, and there are some trials in between, so we are not really sure. Okay? Then it's, of course, masked. And then the first question relates to the ability of processing the information about the thing. So in this particular case, the question is whether the face was male or female. And of course, you can respond this question knowing about what you have seen. But most interestingly, you can also respond to this question even if you do not know what have been shown. Okay? Because of the activation, because of the closed loops in between the visual cortex and the motor cortex. And there are like many studies on subliminal perception that shows that it is actually possible. So that's why we are applying another scale that this time is this one of the subjective measure of awareness scale, on which you are actually, or for example, asking people to what extent they saw the face. So whether they saw it clearly or haven't seen it, or saw a glimpse, or saw something almost clear, or something like that. And this is like the design of the study. And now, just focus on a second, because I will show you the way that we kind of calculate these results, the idea behind the way that the results are calculated. And then the only thing that you will need to see on all of the other graphs that I'll show you is basically the slope of the line. So that then this just basically the justification behind this measure. So if you kind of compare these two measures that I just described, namely the decision on what was presented, like male or female face, okay? And then visibility judgments. Then you've got like 4 possible relations in between those variables. So the first thing that you can think about is basically that you're at chance on deciding whether that was a male or female face, okay? And then you claim you saw nothing. It is obvious, you're not aware, you have no access to the information, nothing interesting is happening here, right? Then we get a second situation, which is much more interesting. So you can have a situation at which you perform the task above chance level. So you're able to correctly discriminate whether the face was male or female. But then there is no difference in this accuracy in between the trials at which you claim you saw clearly and trials at which you claim you saw nothing. Yep, so there is like a processing in the brain, but you claim you haven't kind of seen them. Okay, you cannot dissociate in between them. Okay, so this is kind of the case of implicit processing. And most interestingly, you can see the situation or kind of observe the situation in which both measure correlates. So when you claim you're guessing or you saw nothing, then your performance is a chance. But when you say that you saw something, okay, then your performance is better, okay? And of course, it could be this way or that way, but then the interesting thing is that this line, that this could be steeper or less steep. And then the idea is that the level to which this correlation is significant, okay? So the steeper the slope, the higher the correlation is, of course, the more aware you of what you have seen, okay? So in a sense, you can kind of describe your perception more clearly. Make sense? Yeah. Great. So that's the measure that we are using, and here is just some set of experiments in which we kind of try to investigate the mechanism behind. So the first study, it may look very simple at the very beginning. So the only thing that we manipulate here is basically the order of the task in which you discriminate in between the male and female phase, and then the task at which you judge the visibility. So shouldn't matter, right? Okay. So this is quite a complicated graph, but you know already that the only thing that you're supposed to search for is basically the steepness of the line. So what we can see here is that like the columns are 4 different measures, so it doesn't really matter. So basically it's kind of the auto-replication of the effect that we are just observing. And what you can see is that when we first ask people for the visibility ratings, and then we ask them whether they saw the male or female face, we've got a flat line, especially on the upper line, which is basically the shorter presentation time. But then the difference is significant for all other conditions as well. But then it's steeper when we start with the decision, and then you judge the visibility. So in a sense, it matters whether you first decide on what you have seen and then judge the visibility or not. So like the thing that comes to our mind is that there is a kind of a lot of ways you can think about that. But of course, the first thing is that's just an accident, so you're supposed to replicate it. We actually already got 4 replications here because we've got these 4 scales that you can compare between. Yeah, but then let's replicate it again then. So this is another experiment in which we use much simpler stimuli, also because one of the most obvious hypotheses here that kind of justify why we may got these results and could have a problem with replicating is that it's basically it was typical for the given type of the stimuli. So this is a Gabor patch. This is a good stimulus in psychophysics because it's well known that it's detectable only by V1. So it's just basically very low level stimulus, right? It's just basically the orientation stimulant cells that are kind of responsible for the detection. And to make a long story short, you've got a very similar experiment in which we manipulate the presentation times, and then we manipulate the order of the tasks. So we either firstly ask people about the orientation task, so it was left or right, okay, and then ask them to judge the visibility, or we reverse the order in a very same manner we made it with the previous study. And what you can see here is that we again got this difference. This is plotted slightly differently for your visibility, but this is kind of clear that the line for the trials at which they decide first and then judge the visibility is steeper than those that use the reverse order. So how you can interpret it? Like there are like 2 most obvious hypotheses that you can make here. The first is basically as a time issue. So if you look at this paradigm again, there is a time difference in between a moment at which we judge your visibility on the right side and on the left side, right? Because on the right side, you need to judge immediately after the presentation, so you've got basically less time to judge as compared to the left. So we just make a study, which we were to kind of try to test it. And for that, we are just introduce a third condition at which we make it similar to the condition with the visibility rating first, but then we introduce the additional time for the accumulation of the information. Yeah, so in a sense, we match the time and then still got the order manipulation. So if this doesn't work, that means that it's rather the decision or not the time that matters here. And here are the results. And again, it basically shows that the time doesn't matter so much. And it's kind of contra many models, actually. So there are like models of metacognition, models of decision making that are basically showing that the more time you accumulate the evidence, the more correct you're supposed to be. And it matters, and it's like that for kind of the many situations, but it seems that it's not for the awareness ratings. So it seems that awareness ratings is not using only the information that is kind of fed from the vision. They are using some information that are collected or accumulated later. Okay, so it's kind of the integration in which you're using the visibility content and then add something else to it. So the question that we want to ask right now is what else you can add. Because of course you can say that it's just decision, and it's also to some extent kind of obvious that if you just decide, then you're more confident in what you're saying. So that it's supposed to be like that. So we thought that maybe we can kind of introduce the extra decision in this task. It is calculated slightly differently, so sorry for not plotting in a comparable way, but hopefully it will be readable even without it. So what we made here is that we basically present people with the same Gabor patch, so it was either left or right. And then we present the arrow that was presented or pointed either toward left or toward right. Okay? And people need to press the button that corresponds to the arrow. So this is something that is not related to the main task. Okay, so you're just pressing the arrow. Okay, and then you judge your visibility of the Gabor patch, and then you make the decision about the Gabor patch itself, whether it was left or right. And what we observe is that it doesn't influence the accuracy of the task, or regardless whether you've got the arrow in the same direction that the Gabor was actually oriented, or the opposite direction as the Gabor was actually oriented, or whether there were no arrow at all. But the fact that you react, so actually regardless whether it was left or right, influence your visibility judgments only. So in a sense, it shows that the reaction itself, even if it's not related to the perceptual task, may influence your judgment. And this is in line with the studies that were made by Hakwan Lau like 2 years ago, in which we TMS the SMA, so motor cortex, and he shows that it selectively influences the visibility judgments, but not the ability to recognize in between the orientation of the stimulus. So it seems that you actually can accumulate a lot of information into your visibility judgment, and that the visibility judgment go way more far than the visual information that is at the very beginning of the information processing. The identification task reaction provides the evidence for awareness and increase the rating sensitivity. Okay, so this is how it works in the context of perception, and what we made in a few other studies that were fortunately also published is that we try to kind of investigate the same effect in the context of the different tasks. So as I show you in the very beginning, we've got this idea that basically if you were trying to investigate the mechanism of awareness, it would be good if something that we will find will be replicable in the context of the different content. Of course, perceptual content, but also the content of other things that you may be aware of, namely memory content, decision content, a lot of things like that. So here is a studies that I was just accepted for publication in about the memory study. So here we present the people with the list of words. It was 20 words on the list. For 20 seconds, you need to remember all of them. Of course, it's kind of impossible, but you can try. Then there is a distracting task to make us sure that the working memory is not involved. And then we present the people with a first letter that marks the word from the list that they're supposed to retrieve. And then we show them two options. So whether the word was bottle or button, for example. Okay? And then they respond with the memory awareness scale, which is basically the equivalent of the perceptual awareness scale. So how clear was your memory about the thing. And again, to make a long story short, we found the very same effect in the context of memory. So when so we manipulate the order of the task as comparable to the experiment that I showed you before. And when you judge your awareness of your memory content after the response, so after the decision you make, your accessibility of the memory information is higher as compared to the reverse situation. And we also replicate it in the context of anagram solving tasks, so decision-making and reasoning task, in which you ask people to kind of organize the letters that you are seeing on the left in an appropriate manner to form a word. And then, again, you can either firstly see the possible solution and say that it is correct or not, and then judge your confidence this time on the response you are making, or first judge your confidence and then see the word and then say about the solution, and then the third just control condition in which you firstly see the word and judge your confidence and then decide about the solution. And again, we've got the very same result. So to not go into the details on the procedure itself, it was just to show you that it seems that this mechanism that I'm trying to describe you and this effect that basically shows that something else than the contents only may influence your conscious judgments is replicable in the context of the different tasks, not only in the context of perception. As I said, it's kind of interesting in the context of not only consciousness literature, but also in the context of metacognition models and in the context of the decisional models. So if you're psychology students, you're probably aware of the signal detection model, and it's actually broadly used in the context also in informatics and many other contexts, which is also quite often used to interpret this kind of data. And this model, it's usually look like that. So the main assumption behind is that you've got some distribution of evidence that representing the signal, so that you have seen something, okay? And then you've got some other distribution of either the other stimuli or noise, depending on the way that you just described the model. And then the whole perception is about the dissociating in between those two distributions, okay? So the peaks of these distributions are called compared, and the distance in between them is called the D prime. And the D prime is well known as kind of good measure of the sensitivity of such a system. If you try to introduce the judgments in this kind of the model, namely if you try to introduce confidence, for example, you're just actually adding the additional criteria. So for example, if you're just like really sure, that means that you've got the evidence that's definitely speaking in line of, for example, stimulus that is tilted toward left, but not towards right, or something like that. The problem with this model is that it is very static. So it doesn't make into the account the time, So you do not need any time to accumulate it. It doesn't matter whether you've got the time to accumulate the information or not. And if you try to describe how the judgments are made, you're only feeding the information from the stimulus or the detection task into the judgments. Yeah, so you've got one information, so you've got either information that is speaking for the left distribution, or you've got the information that is speaking toward the right distribution, and then all other judgments that you're making are based on those distributions. Yeah, so you've got only the information that is coming from, for example, visual stimulus. In the decision literature, there are models that are suggesting that you're supposed to elaborate it a bit more on it, and the examples are random walk models and diffusion models, and what they're usually saying is that decision should be rather described as something like that. So you've got like the two boundaries, decision boundaries. So the upper boundaries is the boundaries that will just serve for the decision that the stimulus was tilted toward right, and the lower boundary speaks over the decision that it was tilted toward left. And then you're just collecting the evidence. And of course, if you're collecting evidence, then you're doing it in time. Okay, so you've got a model in which you have not only the information that is collected, but the information that is collected in time, and then the time influence the accuracy of the model. So it looks usually like that. So you're just collecting evidence in time, speaking in favor of the right decision, and then you're just reaching the decision threshold, and you're responding that it was the stimulus that was tilted toward right. And this is nice because it's, and of course, much more complicated if you want to calculate it. But the problem is that this is still the same information that is fed here. Okay, so you've got the perceptual information that you're just collecting in time. You're collecting the evidence in time, but there are still evidence that are connected, at least in the very basic or typical way of describing it, that are just taken from the perceptual stimuli. So if you just introduce the awareness rating for it, you're just basically using the very same information. Nothing else has happened. And there is actually only one model in the literature that is suggesting that there is some additional stage of the accumulation of the evidence that you're using for confidence judgments. Okay, so here we are exactly on what I'm trying to describe you in a context of consciousness literature. So namely, that need to be some additional stage at which you can accumulate the evidence for the visibility. They are using something more than only the information that was fed from the stimulus, for example. And this is the model by Pleskach that is basically suggesting that you are just accumulate the evidence after the decision. So for example, you see the stimulus that is a Gabor patch. You accumulate the evidence to respond whether it was tilted toward left or to right. And then you need some additional time to accumulate the evidence to say that you are confident in the decision or not. And actually what they show is that if you need only a few milliseconds, then you're more confident as compared if you need more time to accumulate the response for the decision. So it's nice, but this is again the model that takes into account only the idea that you just basically feed the information from the visibility ratings. So what we can see here is that it seems that some post-perceptual processing can contribute to the judgments. And what we are trying to show here, and I think that our data speaks into this direction, that in the context of awareness ratings, we can observe something very similar. And it's not only the time that it matters here, but according to the studies that I showed you at the very beginning, it may be also related with the decision you're making. It might be related with the reaction itself, and maybe it's something else. And we will see. Because I'm in between you and the wine, I'll just try to show the theoretical part in short. But just to come back into the consciousness literature for a second, like one of the most influential models of consciousness nowadays is so-called the hierarchical models. So the most known example is the Rosenthal higher-order theory. And what this model basically says, and this is something that is kind of obvious, Professor Duch also said about it a few times, is that if you try to describe the mechanism that is responsible for consciousness, you need to have a part of the brain or part of the cognitive system that basically process the information itself. So you've got the stimulus, then you've got some neural processing that is representing the stimulus in the brain. Then you're making a decision about what you have seen, and then there is an reaction. And all of this may happen without you being aware. So then there is another part of the system that is usually connected with the frontoparietal network in the brain that re-represents this content in you that is processed. So in a sense, it's the part of the brain that accesses not the external world, but the brain itself. So, so the lower part represents the external world, and the upper part represents your inner experience, so to speak. This problem was very influential, but in philosophy, it's very difficult to test it, actually. And there are a lot of reasons for it. There are only a few empirical evidence. This TMS study by Hak-Wan Lau I mentioned before is one of them. And also there's very difficult, this is really the higher order level from the first order level. So the lower part of the graph from the higher part of the graph, because in nature they're always intercorrelated, right? So it's kind of almost impossible to say that you influence one but not the other. Even with TMS, if you pulse the frontal areas, then naturally this is propagated into the visual cortex. So in a sense, it's kind of obvious that you influence the visual cortex by stimulating the prefrontal cortex. So what we can do here? The proposal goes like that. So firstly, we should not focus so much on the measurement of the lower level processing. That is something that is developing, that Professor Duch is developing actually. So what you can use here is just basically any way of decoding of the brain activity. Yeah, and if you've got the method that is sensitive enough, you can just really decode the information from the V1 only. And there are multiple ways of doing it already available. And if you can do so, then you can kind of be sure that this is the part of the representation in the brain that is representing the external world and not your own theory about what is outside. Then you've got this second part that's supposed to re-represent the information and make you aware of the thing, what you later judge on the scale, which is T2 or visibility judgment, for example, scale. And how to dissociate it between them? The idea that we are trying to test, and this is basically to show that the T1 decision is kind of problematic in a context, but because you really do not know where it is. It might be, and it's usually used as a kind of a measure of the effectiveness of this lower part of the graph, but actually there are situations and kind of the task in which it's much more complex that it seems so. So what you can actually do is just try to think about the variables that should influence your, for example, visibility ratings, which are not related to the visibility content itself. And it might be decision, for example, as I show you. It might be the motor reaction, as I show you, and Hak-Wan Lau is speaking as well. And maybe many other things. The one thing that comes to our mind and is also in line in the context of the multiple studies which are recently published in the consciousness literature is that the interoception information may serve as something like that. So the additional advantage of this model is that if you've got this measure right, then you can actually dissociate those two causal paths, which are mathematically, that are just basically responsible for the information from the perception and the information that contributes to this information on the brain level. And there's multiple ways in which you can actually use it later. So what we can do here is basically to integrate the different approaches. So we can integrate this approach from the metacognitive studies that I just described you and from the decisional studies. And we can integrate this model, the hierarchical models, trying to build something that actually enables us to say something about the nature of conscious experience that go beyond the simple re-representation of the visual context, for example. I think that I'll finish with one example of the studies that is basically showing how it may work in the context of more physiological data. And this is the study that we published in January this year about the influence of the interoceptive information on visibility judgments. So as you saw before, the idea was that you can kind of think about the list of the variables that will selectively influence the visibility judgments, but not the decision about whether the stimulus was, for example, tilted to the left or to the right. So we made a very similar stimulus that I just described you before. Namely, we present people with the Gabor patch, then it was masked, then we asked people to judge whether it was tilted to the left or to the right. And then we asked them to, I don't know why there is a PAS, but it's supposed to be blank. Okay, so there's left-right decision, then 3 seconds of silence, you see nothing. The only thing that you're doing here is that we were recording the heartbeats. Okay, so the idea is that we are just recording the response or heartbeat response on the decision that you're making. And then we've got the visibility ratings. And to make a very complicated story short, what we found is that, so here is slightly different, another slope, but this time you need to kind of represent your x and y axis for our analysis. So this time, what you are seeing on the x is the time of the accumulation of the information in a heartbeat. And it's actually comparison to the baseline. So at the very beginning, what you usually observe is the deceleration of the heartbeat after the decision, and then the heart accelerates with time. And what you're seeing then, the red line is just the trials at which people make a correct decision, and the blue line is the trials at which the people make an error. So what you are seeing here is there's basically the difference in the heart response in between the error trials and correct trials on the different levels of the visibility. And then the upper graph is the trials at which people claim that they saw nothing, and then saw a glowing limbs, so almost clearly, and then the very end, on the very bottom, there is the graph in which you see the trials that people claim that they saw clearly. And what you can see here is that the information about the visibility was to some extent encoded in the heartbeat. Okay, so in a sense, what we claim, and which we managed to convince the reviewers, is that the information is fed from the heartbeat, is fed into the visibility judgment. So in a sense, it is a kind of another variable that is actually influenced what you're claiming about your visibility, which is, I think, kind of interesting. And we've made a lot of other studies with Marta Łukowska, who is the main author of this paper, and to kind of show that this is actually the thing. We are actually proud to host Hugo Critchley in Krakow to make to review this thesis, and he also said that it's quite convincing. So hope that you will find it convincing as well. Because of the lack of the time, I will just skip the last experiment about the EEG, and I'll just leave you with a few conclusions, especially because I just want to use 2 minutes at the very end to say something about my lab. So to conclude on the points that I made at the very beginning, I hope I convince you that the time of the focus on the perceptual processes has passed away, in a sense that it's the time to try to build the model of consciousness that is trying to take more type of context into the consideration. Then it's not that the consciousness is not about the availability of the content that you need to represent, but rather about the integration of the information from the perceptual processing with some other things that are already the system. And you make a long list of things that are actually integrated here. I show you 3, but in the literature you may find a lot of other examples actually. And it seems that this information is not really fed from the visual processing, but it's integrated also on a brain level. And this is the thing that we are right now trying to test, both with the TMS, and we just got the grant of MRI that we will test together with Christian Sandberg and Ryota Kanai and Jan Lambert. So Christian is UCL, Christian is Aarhus University, and Ryota is from Japan, trying to show it on the similar idea. At least this is my part of the project, to show this idea, because I'm not really sure whether they will agree with me on it, on the MRI data. So yeah, and also I hope I convince you that it speaks something also about the metacognition models and the decision models, showing that this should be also kind of developed, showing that the action and the decision making may contribute to the metacognitive judgments. Okay, so thanks for listening. And the only thing that I just want to say at the very end is that all of the studies was not done by myself only, of course, because it will never be possible. So we have funded a lab that is focusing on the consciousness studies in Krakow. It's actually quite a funny story about the Polish science that is also connected with Professor Duch, by the way. That it was funded in 2009, so we've got 10 years next year, and it was funded on Cyprus. And it was funded on Cyprus because we attended a conference that Professor Duch attended as well on consciousness, organized within the COST network, at which I met a friend from my department, Marek Binder. And we haven't known that we were working on the same thing. So it was kind of sad, yeah, because that was a time in Polish university which each of us were just making experiments on their own and never collaborate. And we thought that this is the time to change it. And at that time, we dreamed that we'll be able to build something that will try to tackle with the problem that we were discussing more broadly. And it seems that 9 years has passed away, and it's actually something that we observe right now. So this is a group of the very talented people that are just making the studies together with me. Marek Binder, Boris Pawlewicz, who is specializing in the statistics, Marta Siedlecka, who is working mainly on metacognition, Magdalena Reuter, who is working on sensory substitution, that thing that I haven't mentioned here, but we are just working on it as well. And a group of PhD students. I will not mention each of them separately, but just to mention the main things that we are just focusing in right now is that the TMS studies that Justyna Chobot is specializing, and also recently the MRI studies, which is Katarzyna Hat thing. And last but not the least, we are also quite interdisciplinary. So we've got the biomedical engineer in our group. We've got 2 philosophers. So it seems that we are trying to tackle the problem from the broad perspective, using, as you saw with my examples, multiple methods, both in perception, interoception, working memory, decision making, and many more. Multiple methods, and also investigating the different groups of patients. I've just said only about the healthy patient studies, participant studies, but we also do some patient studies. It is the thing that Marek Binder is actually specializing, and he's making the studies in Toruń, which also connects us on this. Last slide, yeah, almost the last slide, is that the announcement of the conference. Only one, but very soon. We are about to organize the annual conference of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, the largest community or society making the consciousness studies on the world. It will be in Krakow in June this year, so feel invited. The call for papers is of course closed, but the registration is still possible. So here are the keynotes. Yeah, I also got the announcement about the position that is available. We also are searching for the postdoc on our side that's specializing in MRI data analysis. We are just like focusing on the structural analysis, so this is something that we are about to focus soon. Thank you for your attention.
So yeah, in simple non-psychological terminal terms, what were the main findings of these 3 studies? Like if there were 3 things you could say, or one.
Okay, so it's basically the thing that we want to show is that if you judge your visibility, the judgment is not based only on visual information. It's based on many other things. And this many other things includes decision and reaction even. And also that this reaction could not even be related with the perception. Yeah, so that you may just press the button, or you may be tracked to or forced to press a button by the TMS, for example. This is actually the study that we're about to do so quite soon. And this will influence the visibility judgments. So you claim that you see better even though nothing happens in the external world that make you see better. Your brain is thinking that you should see better.
If I can summarize it in one sentence, just do it, right? If you do it, then you make less errors than if you first think, well, have I seen that? And then do it. And then the number of errors is larger, right? Just do it.